All right. Today we are going to go over some of the stuff that you were reading about yesterday. Yesterday you read about some of the political revolutions in Latin America, places like Mexico, all over South America, so on and so forth. You also read about the rise of nationalistic movements in Europe during the same time period. Nationalism is a really important term to understand. And it's one that, man, we're going to use throughout the rest of the course. For countries that are already established, right? It's a sort of almost hyper form of patriotism. It's an extreme pride in your nation, which sometimes can border kind of on arrogance. But for places that don't have countries of their own, like our colonies in the New World, like some of the different groups in Europe that were ruled over by these very large multi-ethnic empires, it's the desire for self-government, for popular sovereignty, to have nations of their own. Nationalism is a really popular force during this time period. The 1800s, even into the 1900s, you're going to see the creation of a lot of new countries. Sometimes through, political revolutions, sometimes through other means. So that's kind of what you read about yesterday. Political revolutions in Latin America, and specifically some nationalist kind of uprisings in Europe that led to the creation of modern day Italy and Germany. So today we're going to very briefly just touch on some of the vocab you're supposed to do, show you some pictures, show you some maps, stuff like that. There's a little bit of note taking you may want to do. I'm going to leave it as optional, but I will tell you the things that I'm going to ask you to add will be very beneficial for the SAQ that we'll talk about at the end of class. We've got 2 video clips today, 2 crash courses, which, crash courses, they're crash courses. But they are very informative, and if you pay attention, I think it's going to make your SAQ at the end that much easier. SAQ, probably not going to have a chance to do it in class. Kind of depends on how much time we have after the videos, how much time you think it'll take you. It is 3 questions. You'll have 12 minutes to get it done. If we do not do it in class, it is going to be for homework. But again, shouldn't take you very long. It's only 12 minutes. That is going to be due tonight before midnight. So make sure you get that done. Excuse me. I'm going to give you all sorts of hints as to some things that you should know for these questions that you're going to be answering. So again, pay attention, jot down what you need to, and be prepared. I'll tell you what notes you're going to want to use for the SAQ as well, in addition to the ones that we're going to discuss today. Other news and notes, grades. The semester exam review, that was the first grade of this 6 weeks. It is double weighted. It is late. It was due last Friday, but I'm still accepting it. So if you have not turned that in, you want to turn it in, please do so as soon as you can. Also, last night before midnight, that document analysis assignment over the declarations, that was due. If you did not turn it in, it's late. But if you can get it in at some point today, it's only 20 points off, which, is not the end of the world. The other thing, and this doesn't so much apply to anybody in here, but this is for the benefit of the kids at home that are going to watch this recording, and for you guys. Guys, attendance is super important in high school. It's important in school in general. But you have to be present a certain amount of time to get credit. I had kids last semester that technically should have passed, but they're not going to get credit because they missed too many days. To get credit for a semester, you have to be present 90% of the time. All right? So if you start getting up to 9, 10, 11 absences, you're beyond that. Okay, that's when you'll have to start making up time like we did last semester in the cafeteria. You don't want that. It's really kind of a rude awakening when you think, oh, my grades are okay, I'm going to pass this semester, and then at the end of the semester, or in this case, the end of the year, you find out you weren't here enough. So monitor that. I mean, you guys here in person, obviously be here. For the kids on, online, make sure you're logging in every day. But man, attendance is really important, and there were a decent number of kids last semester that didn't get credit just because they didn't log in or they weren't here enough. So keep those things in mind. You got to be here. The attendance does play a part in your grade. All right, so let's go ahead and get started talking about political revolutions, European nationalism, nationalism in general. mainly talking about the 1800s. At this point, we've had the American Revolution. We've had the French Revolution. We've had the Haitian Revolution. This is what comes next. And again, those prior revolutions, they certainly gave some inspiration to the revolutions that were still to come. So yesterday, you did your vocab. Numbers 1 through 7, 1 through 6 are Latin America. Miguel Hidalgo, hero of one of the early revolutions, wars of independence in Mexico. Benito Juarez, also kind of involved in that. Cadillo, the formation of military dictatorships. Unfortunately, you're going to see that a lot in the history of Latin America. Simón Bolívar, hero of many of the revolutions in South America. Lola Rodriguez de Tio, she is an agitator, I guess you could say, in Puerto Rico. The propaganda movement, not in Latin America. This actually went on in the Philippines, but like much of Latin America, the Philippines was colonized by Spain. So that's part of the story as well. And then 8, 9, and 10 all have to do with the European section. Realpolitik, sort of a pragmatic worldview. Otto von Bismarck, Ottomanism. These are terms and names associated with the rise of European nationalism. Again, I'm not going to define them all for you. That's up to you. But some of this stuff could certainly be used to help you answer your SAQ questions. I would also look over your cause and effect charts over the American, French, and Haitian Revolution. I would look at your charts over the Enlightenment. I would also look at, it was in our last notebook check, the age of isms vocabulary, like liberalism and whatnot. A lot of that stuff, some of that vocab could be used in your SAQ. Because again, to successfully, answer one of these short answer questions, you need something very specific to base your answer around. A term, a name, person, place, idea, something that you can then kind of go into greater detail on, define, describe, and then explain, just kind of its historical impact and all the details you can muster. Again, for the SAQ, we do try to go by the ACE format. If you forgot what that is, the ACE handout is under today's date. You may want to review that and the notes I just went over prior to getting started on our SAQ, either at the end of class or this evening. So first, let's talk about the political revolutions of Latin America. And pictured here, you see 3 very prominent individuals. One of them they kind of left out of this edition of the AMSCO book for some reason. You've got Miguel Hidalgo, you've got Simón Bolívar, and you've got, I believe it's José de San Martín. All heroes of these various revolutions that transpired in the 1800s in Latin America. On the map to the left, you can kind of see dates of independence. It starts with the Haitian Revolution. Again, a little bit different than most of the other political revolutions in the Americas in that the core issue was slavery, rebelling against slavery, establishing their own nation where slavery would be abolished. But that happened in Latin America, in that geographic region. And man, these other territories just started to fall like dominoes. And by the time you get to roughly the early to mid 1800s, most of the now countries of Latin America had declared their independence from either the Spanish or the Portuguese primarily, and had won those wars of independence. Why though? Why did they want to be independent? Very similar to some of our other charts, have given you some reasons, some motivations. I will tell you, some of this could come up on the SAQs. So, take that for what it's worth. I'm not going to require that you copy this stuff down. I'm not going to check it in your notebook, but I'm telling you, this will help. So, sometimes these are called the Creole revolutions in Latin America. If you recall, in Latin America, especially in the Spanish territories, but also to some extent in the Portuguese, you had a sort of caste system, a casta system, a social hierarchy based on racial purity, Essentially, the more European you were, the higher up on the social scale you were. You had the Peninsulares, people from the Iberian Peninsula, from Spain and Portugal itself. Below them, you had the Creoles. They were full-blooded Spanish and Portuguese, but they were born here in the New World. From there, you had the mestizos, a mixture of European and native influences, and then it just kind of trickled down from there. Really, really messed up. Well, one of the reasons these are sometimes referred to as the Creole revolutions, those kind of second-tier Spanish or Portuguese, the full-blooded Europeans that were born here in the New World, they were one of the driving forces behind these wars of independence. They had wealth, they had influence, but they still felt like they were being treated unfairly based on where they were born. So let's talk about some of these motivations. First, just like pretty much all of our political revolutions of this time period, you do have the influence of the Enlightenment. And, in this case, you have the influence of previous revolutions. Like we said, before all these other revolutions in Mexico and Central America and South America and so on and so forth, you already had the American Revolution in the New World. You had the French Revolution in the Old World, which created a lot of instability. More on that here in a second. And you had the Haitian Revolution in the New World, specifically in Latin America. As far as Enlightenment ideals, representation and guaranteed civil liberties, those are big parts of it. But for the colonies in the New World, there was that true desire for what we call popular sovereignty. Essentially, the ability to govern themselves, to choose their own government, to not be ruled from afar. Popular sovereignty based on Enlightenment principles. That's one of the similarities we see in just about all of the political revolutions of this time. Next, many Creoles were wealthy owners of estates, mines, or businesses. They opposed Spanish, key word, mercantilism, which required colonists to buy manufactured goods only from Spain and sell products only to Spain. If you recall, in the days of initial European colonialism, imperialism in the New World, mercantilism, that was the economic philosophy. The colonies were there to make money for the colonizers, to make money for the mother country. And after many, many years, just like in the American Revolution, the Creoles and others in Latin America, they kind of resented this. They wanted more economic freedom. We saw this a little bit in the American Revolution. Those 13 British colonies. Yeah, at first they were probably pretty loyal to Great Britain, but 150 years later, they've been doing their own thing for a really long time. Yet they've still got their economic destiny determined by the British. Well, here it was the same situation. It was just the Spanish and the Portuguese. So mercantilism, big similar cause, big similar motivation in a lot of these political revolutions. Once again, Creoles, they wanted more political power. They resented that Spain tended to give important government jobs in the colonies, mainly only to the Peninsulares. Again, the casta system, the unequal treatment of individuals based on how European they were, I guess you could say, that was a motivating factor. And because the Creoles, they were full-blooded European, but they also had a lot of wealth and influence. They were some of the ones that had the ability to kind of kick off some of these political revolutions. You also have the majority, which after several years were mestizos. You look at the majority of people of Latin American descent in Latin America to this day. I guess technically you would call them mestizos, in that their ethnicity, their heritage is primarily a mixture of European, usually Spanish, Portuguese, and native influences. Well, the mestizos, they wanted some political power too. Again, they were treated even worse, way worse than the Creoles, and they felt that, independence would give them the opportunity to gain more wealth, to gain more influence. Many of the mestizos had jobs in the towns. They worked in the mines. They worked on the estates of the Peninsulares and the Creoles. They were the majority, and they wanted their freedom. Lastly, though, and he's going to come up a lot in both these political revolutions, in Latin America. He's part of the Haitian Revolution, but also the rise of nationalism in Europe. You got old Napoleon. Napoleon, if you recall, he takes over at the end of the French Revolution. And then he wages war against most of Europe, actually conquering most of the continent. Well, because most countries were at war with Napoleon in Europe, you know, the British, the French, you know, well, he was the French, the Spanish, the Portuguese. I mean, that created instability on the continent of Europe, and therefore their colonies overseas, in this case, the Spanish and the Portuguese colonies. I mean, that sort of instability, just like it had for Haiti, kind of opened the door to make it a little bit easier for the colonists to rebel. Again, there's more to this, as you're about to see in the video we're going to watch, our first video. But these are some of the primary motivations. These are some of the similar motivations that you see amongst most of the Latin American revolutions. And really, you could even say, you could even add the American Revolution in with some of this, especially, you know, the desire to do away with mercantilism and also some of the ideas of the Enlightenment, specifically, you know, regarding popular sovereignty. So, really important slide. If you want to take a picture, go ahead. This is something that might help you on the SAQ. All right. We're now going to watch our first video of the day. It's over the Latin American political revolutions. It is a crash course. He's going to talk really, really fast. You can take notes. I mean, if you see something that you think will help you, especially like cool details you might be able to add into your writing, more power to you. But as long as you're paying attention, you're going to be okay. I think paying attention to these is a lot more important than feverishly trying to write down everything, because that will just get frustrating. Okay, pay attention, soak it in. Just know you don't need to know every single little detail, but definitely have an idea of the big picture. Here we go.
Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course World History, and today I think it's going to get a little bit confusing because we're going to talk about revolution and independence in Latin America. It's a bit confusing because one, Latin America is big. Two, it's very diverse. Three, Napoleon makes everything complicated. And four, as we've seen in the past, sometimes revolutions turn out not to be that revolutionary. Witness, for instance, the New England Revolution, who instead of like trying to form new and better governments are always just kicking like all the other soccer teams. Right, so before independence, Latin American society was characterized by three institutions that exercised control over the population. The first was the Spanish crown, or if you were Brazilian, the Portuguese crown. So as far as Spain was concerned, the job of the colonies was to produce revenue in the form of a 20% tax on everything that was called the royal fifth. So government administration was pervasive and relatively efficient because it had to be in order to collect its royal fifth. Then there was the Catholic Church. Even more than royal officials, the church exercised influence over people's everyday lives. I mean, the church even controlled time. The church bells tolled out the hours, and they mandated a 7-day work week so that people could go to church on Sunday. And finally, there was patriarchy. In Latin America, like much of the world, husbands had complete control over their wives, and any extra or premarital scoodly pooping was severely punished. I mean, when it was the women doing the illicit scoodly pooping, men could basically get up to whatever. This was mainly about property rights, because illegitimate children could inherit their father's property, but it was constructed to be about, you know, purity. To get a sense of how patriarchy shaped Latin American lives, take a gander at Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, whose name I'm actually abbreviating. A child prodigy who spoke 5 languages by the age of 16, de la Cruz wanted to disguise herself as a boy so she could attend university, but she was forbidden to do so. Still, she wrote plays and poetry, she studied math and natural science, and for being one of the leading minds of the 17th century, she was widely attacked and eventually forced to abandon her work and sell all 4,000 of her books. That's a shame, because she had a great mind, once writing that Aristotle would have written more if he'd done any cooking. A couple other things. First, Latin America led the world in transculturation, or cultural blending. A new
syncretism, another way to say it.
Mixing 1, whites from Spain called Peninsulares, 2, whites born in the Americas called Creoles, 3, Native Americans, and 4, African slaves. This blending of cultures may be most obvious when looking at Native American and African influences on Christianity. The Virgin of Guadalupe, for instance, was still called Tanatzin, the indigenous earth goddess, by Indians, and the profusion of blood in Mexican iconography recalls the Aztec use of blood in ritual. The transculturation pervaded Latin American life, from food to secular music to fashion. Somewhat related, Latin America had a great deal of racial diversity and a rigid social hierarchy to match. There were 4 basic racial categories: white, black, mestizo, a mix of white and American Indian, and mulatto, a mix of white and black. We try not to use that word anymore because it's offensive, but that's the word they use. And from the 16th century on, Latin America had a huge diversity of mixed-race people, and there were constant attempts to classify and divide them into castes. You can see some of these in so-called Costa paintings, which attempted to establish in a very weird and enlightenment-y way all the possible racial combinations. But of course, that's not how race works, as evidenced by the fact that successful people of lower racial castes could become legally white by being granted gracias al sacar. So by 1800, Latin America's independence movements, roughly a quarter of people were mixed race. All right, now let's have some revolutions. How should we organize this, Stan? Let's begin with Latin America's most successful country as defined by quality of soccer team. So Brazil, he said as thousands of Argentines booed him, is obviously different because it was ruled not by Spain, but by Portugal. But like a lot of revolutions in Latin America, it was fairly conservative. The Creoles wanted to maintain their privilege while also achieving independence from the Peninsulares. And also, like a lot of Latin American revolutions, it featured Napoleon. Freaking Napoleon. You're everywhere. He's behind me, isn't he? Yeah! So when Napoleon took over Portugal in 1807, the entire Portuguese royal family and their royal court decamped to Brazil. And it turned out they loved Brazil. King João loved Brazil so much. Off topic, do you think that JWoww named herself after King João? I mean, does she have that kind of historical sensibility? I think she does. So King João's life in Rio was so good that even after Napoleon was defeated at the Battle of Waterloo, he just kind of stayed in Brazil. And then by 1820, the Portuguese in Portugal were like, hey, maybe you should come back and, like, you know, govern us, King of Portugal. So in 1821, he reluctantly returned to Lisbon, leaving his son, Prince Pedro, behind. Meanwhile, Brazilian Creoles were organizing themselves around the idea that they were culturally different from Portugal, and they eventually formed a Brazilian party. Stan, not that kind of party, come on. Yes, that kind. A Brazilian party to lobby for independence. And in 1822, they convinced Prince Pedro of boring old Portugal that he should just become King Pedro of sexy big Brazil. So Pedro declared Brazil an independent constitutional monarchy with himself as king. As a result, Brazil achieved independence without much bloodshed and managed to hold on to that social hierarchy with the plantation owners on top. And that explains why Brazil was the last New World country to abolish slavery, not fully abandoning it until 1888. Right, so even when Napoleon wasn't forcing Portuguese royals into an awesome exile, he was still messing with Latin America. Let's go to a thought bubble. So Latin America's independence movement began not with Brazil, but in Mexico, when Napoleon put his brother on the Spanish throne in 1808. Napoleon wanted to institute the liberal principles of the French Revolution, which angered the ruling elite of the Peninsulares in what was then called New Spain. They were aristocrats. They just wanted to go back to some good old-fashioned divine right monarchy with a strong church. So the Mexican Creoles, seeking to expand their own power at the expense of the Peninsular elite, saw an opportunity here. They affirmed their loyalty to the new king, who was French, even though he was the king of Spain. I told you this was complicated. Then a massive peasant uprising began, led by a renegade priest, Padre Hidalgo, and supported by the Creoles because it was aimed at the Peninsulares, even though they weren't actually the ones who supported Spain. This was further complicated by the fact that to the mestizo peasants led by Hidalgo, Creoles and Peninsulares looked and acted basically identical. They were both white and imperious, so the peasants often attacked the Creoles, who were technically on their side in trying to overthrow the ruling Peninsulares. Even though it had tens of thousands of supporters, this first peasant uprising petered out, but a second peasant revolt led by another priest, Father Morelos, was much more revolutionary. In 1813, he declared independence, and the revolt lasted until his death in 1815. But since he was a mestizo, he didn't gain much Creole support, so revolutionary fervor in Mexico began to fade until 1820. When Spain, which was now under the rule of a Spanish rather than a French king, had a real liberal revolution with a new constitution that limited the power of the church. Thanks, Thought Bubble. So in the wake of Spain's liberalizing movement, the Mexican elites who had previously supported Spain switched sides and made common cause with the Creoles in the hopes that they could somehow hold on to their privileges. And pushing for independence together, things went very well. The Creole general Iturbide and the rebel mestizo commander Guerrero joined forces and won independence, with most of the Peninsulares returning to Spain. Iturbide, the whiter of the two generals, became king of Mexico in 1822. Remember, this was a revolution essentially against representative government, but that didn't work out, and within a year he was overthrown by the military and a republic was declared. Popular sovereignty was sort of victorious, but without much benefit to the peasants who actually made independence possible. This alliance between conservative landowning elites and the army, especially in the face of calls for land reform or economic justice, would happen over and over again in the next century and a half. But before we come to any conclusions, let's discuss one last revolution. So Venezuela had a cadre of well-trained Creole revolutionaries who by 1811 had formed a revolutionary junta that seized power in Caracas and formed a republic. But the interior of Venezuela was home to mixed-race cowboys called llaneros who supported the king. They kept the Caracas revolutionaries from extending their power inland, and that is where Simón Bolívar, El Libertador, enters the picture. Bolívar realized that the only way to overcome the various class divisions, like the one between the Caracas Creoles and the llaneros, was to appeal to a common sense of South Americanness. I mean, after all, the one thing that almost all South Americans had in common, they were born in South America, not Spain. So then, partly through shows of toughness that included like crossing flooded plains and going without sleep, Bolívar convinced the llaneros to give up fighting for Spain and start fighting against them. He quickly captured the vice-regal capital at Bogota, and by 1822, his forces had taken Caracas and Quito. Hold on. Let's not be attacked by Argentines who are already upset about what I said about their really good soccer team. I want to make one thing clear. Argentina's General José de San Martín was also vital to the defeat of the Spanish. He led expeditions against the Spanish in Chile, and also a really important one in Lima. And then in December of 1824, at the Battle of Ayacucho, the last Spanish viceroy was finally captured, and all of Latin America was free from Spain. Oh, it's time for the open letter? That's a chair, Stan, but it's not the chair. An open letter to Simón Bolívar. But first, let's see what's in the secret compartment today. Oh, Llanero. I wonder if his hips swivel when I wind him up. Context is everything. They do. Hey there, cowboy. Dear Simón Bolívar, first you had fantastic mutton chops. As if you're some kind of handsome Martin Van Buren. You were a man of immense accomplishments, but those accomplishments have been richly rewarded. I mean, you have a country named after you, not to mention 2 different currencies. But for my purposes, the most important thing you ever did was die. You may not know this, Simón Bolívar, but when I am not a world history teacher sitting next to a fake fireplace, I am a novelist. And your last words, damn it, how will I ever get out of this labyrinth, feature prominently in my first novel, Looking for Alaska. Except it turns out those weren't your last words. Your last words were probably, Jose, bring the luggage. But I decided to use your fancy, romantic, inaccurate last words. It's called artistic license. Put that in your luggage. Anyway, fantastic life. I just wish you nailed it a little bit better with your last words. Best wishes, John Green. So by 1825, almost the entire Western Hemisphere, with a few exceptions in the Caribbean, was free from European rule. Oh, right, and Canada. I'm just kidding, Canadians. It's so easy to make fun of you because you're so nice. So I tease you, and then you're like, oh, thanks for noticing that we exist. My pleasure. Anyway, this is pretty remarkable, especially when you consider that most of this territory had been under Spanish or Portuguese control for almost 300 years. The most revolutionary thing about these independence movements were that they enshrined the idea of so-called popular sovereignty in the New World. Never again would Latin America be under the permanent control of a European power, and a relatively quick division of Latin America into individual states, despite Bolívar's pan-South American dream, showed how quickly the people in these regions developed a sense of themselves as nations, distinct from Europe and from each other. This division into nation-states prefigures what would happen to Europe in the mid-19th century, and in that sense, Latin America is the leader of 19th century world history. And Latin American history presages another key theme in modern life, multiculturalism. And all of that makes Latin America sound very modern, but in a number of ways, Latin American independence wasn't terribly revolutionary. First, while the Peninsulares were gone, the rigid social hierarchy with the wealthy Creoles at the top remained. Second, whereas revolutions in both France and America weakened the power of the established church, in Latin America, the Catholic Church remained very powerful in people's everyday lives. And then there is the patriarchy. Although there were many women who took up arms in the struggle for independence, including Juana Azurduy, who led a cavalry charge against Spanish forces in Bolivia, patriarchy remained strong in Latin America. Feminist ideas like those of Mary Wollstonecraft would have to wait. Women weren't allowed to vote in national elections in Mexico until 1953, and Peru didn't extend voting rights to women until 1955. Also, Latin America's revolutionary wars were long and bloody. 425,000 people died in Mexico's war for independence. And they didn't always lead to stability. Venezuela, for instance, experienced war for much of the 19th century, leading to as many as 1 million deaths. And it's important to note that fighting for freedom doesn't always lead to freedom. The past 2 centuries in Latin America have seen many military dictatorships that protect private property at the expense of egalitarian governance. Freedom, independence, and autonomy are complicated terms that mean different things to different people at different times. So too with the word revolutionary. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week. Location change.
And that's one of the things that we're going to talk about moving forward. Yeah, you get political independence out of these revolutions and self-government, but That doesn't mean there's not going to be more problems. There's going to be instability moving forward. There's going to be other internal revolutions that we will discuss in Latin America throughout a lot of the rest of the class. Let's move across the pond, so to speak, and let's go to Europe. Europe has changed an awful lot over the years. And to kind of illustrate that point, let's look at kind of the very beginning of the time period we've been discussing, the 1700s, just prior to the American Revolution and the French Revolution. This is essentially what Europe looked like. Note, you don't really have Germany yet. You don't really have Italy yet. In Germany, you essentially had the Holy Roman Empire still at that point, a bunch of small independent kingdoms that some of which wanted to form something new. In Italy, you had rival Italian kingdoms and city-states. Things start to change, though, with Napoleon in France. I mean, if you look, by the time you get to 1800, you know, things have already started to change quite a bit. But really, after the Napoleonic Wars, when Napoleon, you know, marched through Europe and really kind of spread a lot of those ideas of the French Revolution, those Enlightenment ideas, those nationalist ideas, you know, nothing can ever really go back to normal. And even though shortly after this, like in 1815, I think, you know, Napoleon at that point was more or less defeated. There's this Congress that you read about, the Congress of Vienna, 1815, where they tried to establish or reestablish the old national borders. Those ideas had already spread, those Enlightenment ideas, those ideas, again, of nationalism, of different people, you know, uniting under a single nation, you know, based on their cultural similarities. And what we're going to talk about next is the fact that after this, you do get two brand new countries, amongst others, but the ones we're really going to focus on are Germany, which used to be a lot bigger, and Italy. That being said, nationalism is not going away. You'll notice after World War I, Germany shrinks, breaks up. The Austrian-Hungarian Empire is evaporated into something new. You'll see another spread of nationalism after World War II. Nationalism is one of the big forces that led us into both of our world wars. And it's one of those forces that helps explain why the world looks the way it does. Like I said, a lot of new countries coming out of the 1800s and early 1900s. Nationalism is the big deal. Now, the two that the video is really going to focus on, and the main two that you read about were the creation, really for the first time, of a true blue united Germany and, of course, of a united Italy. I will tell you, you want to look for similarities in their nationalistic movements. And we understand why nationalism was so popular. You know, people wanting to govern themselves, wanting to create nations of their own. Popular in Europe, popular in the New World as well. But specifically, look at these two situations. Based on the reading, based on the video, how are these nationalistic movements, how are they set up? It might be a pretty big hint. It's something you will have to discuss in the FAQ. So we got one more video. It's another crash course. This is actually from European history. So it is going to get into some pretty specific areas, but again, just kind of look at the high notes, look at the big picture, try not to get bogged down with too many of the details. Now, here's the deal. In the European one, he talks like really slow. It's weird. It's like he's trying to make up for the fact that he talks so fast in the world history ones. That being said, we're kind of used to him talking fast by now. And I think, you know, seeing him talk fast and then hearing him talk slow might kind of throw you off. So I sped it up just a little bit to 1.25. This is more in line with how he talks in world history. It'll also make sure that we get done with it in a timely manner. Pay attention again, Italian unification, German unification, the creation of these new nation states. How was that all similar? How was the rise of nationalism in those areas similar? Okay, think about it. Maybe look for that. Write some of that
Hi,
stuff.
I'm John Green, and this is Crash Course European History. So if you look at Europe today, you'll note that two of the European Union's largest economies, Italy and Germany, have not existed as unified kingdoms or sovereign states during our first 26 episodes. We tend to think of Europe's nation-states as static and long-standing, but one of my great-grandfathers was born before Italy became a unified country. Now, I know that I am old, but I'm not that old. What's that? Oh, our with their hands, that Germans have extremely punctual public transport, are quite new, because in 1850, most Italians wouldn't have called themselves Italians. They would have been Genoese or Sicilian or Bavarian. The post-revolutionary European world became one of dramatic nation building that ultimately set the stage for 20th century nationalistic fervor. But before we can get nationalist passions riled up, we need to make some more nations. The first of the disruptive nation builders was Napoleon III, Napoleon Bonaparte's nephew. He set out to create a lavish court, boost the economy, create banks, build railroads, and otherwise modernize France. Politically, he set up a rubber stamp legislature, meaning that mostly they just existed to agree with him, and he also outlawed worker activism. Napoleon III's modus operandi was war, as it would be for many of the nation builders of the mid-19th century, and he helped provoke the Crimean War, a short, miserable, and especially deadly one. In it, France, Britain, and the Ottoman Empire fought Russia, which had been challenging Britain across Asia, and the special genius of Napoleon III was to get Austria not to come to the aid of Russia and instead to remain neutral. This cracked the holy alliance of Russia, Prussia, and Austria that had been set up to stabilize Europe, and Russia's defeat in the war ensured that it would not help squash revolution as it had in 1848. Instead, Russia reeled from its military and other shortcomings. By the 1860s, the Tsar recognized the need to free the serfs, reform the military, and set up modern judicial procedures in order to save his autocratic system, or at least to save it for another 50 years. Let's go to the thought bubble. Napoleon III used the peace after the Crimean War to remake Paris into a modern world capital, and to the south, Camille de Cavour aimed to create a unified Italian state. Like Napoleon, he was an economic modernizer who set up steamship companies, experimented in agriculture, and traveled to see the latest in modernization projects. Cavour became prime minister for the King of Piedmont, Sardinia, who allowed him to move forward with these modernization plans. Napoleon III saw advantages in supporting him, so he signed on as an ally in defeating Austria, which controlled northern Italy. Napoleon's idea was that Piedmont would get Austria's territory in northern Italy, Napoleon would get the center, and the Pope would rule kind of an Italian confederation. So, in accordance with this plan, in 1859, Piedmont provoked Austria into declaring war and quickly gained victories. But Cavour and his army looked so good in victory that Italians rallied behind him and were like, I think we want to be Italian and not French, thus thwarting Napoleon's plans. In 1860, the revolutionary and Democrat Giuseppe Garibaldi gathered up 1,000 volunteers, mostly teenagers, clad them in red shirts, and headed by ship to Sicily, where revolts against aristocratic landlords were already underway. He planned to capture the south for a unified Italy, and in 1860, he and his forces succeeded in doing so. Then they moved northward to unite with the forces of Piedmont, and in 1861, the Kingdom of Italy was declared. Thanks, Thought Bubble. So a small pause is necessary here. Why is Garibaldi, a pro-republic romantic leader, working on behalf of a monarch like the King of Piedmont? Why is Cavour, the modernizer and prime minister of a monarchy, joining the likes of Garibaldi? Well, by the 1850s, romantic dreams of national unification and the rule of the people gave way to what is known as realpolitik, or power politics, or realism in politics. Gone were the heartfelt assertions that political actions were the will of God, or that they achieved some divine or romantic destiny on behalf of the nation. Better, it was argued, to be realistic and get things done. German politician Otto von Bismarck expressed realpolitik best when he said, Germany looks not to Prussia's liberalism. The great questions of the day will not be settled by speeches and majority decisions, but by blood and iron. Bismarck became one of the most successful practitioners of realpolitik, and in the process created the modern German Empire. As a young adult, Bismarck's life had basically no seriousness of purpose. I had one of those young adulthoods as well. Born to a well-to-do landed aristocrat or Junker, he was a carouser and imbiber, and generally a lout as a university student. Boy, this is familiar. He built up so many debts that he gave up a career in the civil service to return home and help run the family farm. All right, finally our lives are diverging. But I guess they're about to diverge further, since he was arguably the most important European politician of the second half of the 19th century, and I'm, on the other hand, I've never started a war. Bismarck's life got a lot more serious after he met and married Johanna Puttkammer, a devout Lutheran who gave him a more peaceful home life to balance the political turmoil that he came to embrace. His ultimate ambition was to become a major player in German and international politics, but I've known a lot of drunken and heavily indebted partiers, and they all have big dreams. What makes Bismarck so astonishing is the extent to which he succeeded. He made his return to the political scene as Prussia's delegate to assemblies of the German states, and then as ambassador to Russia, and through these roles, the staunchly monarchist Bismarck learned lessons about diplomacy and international affairs, and about economic liberals and their constitutional values. He came not to oppose a constitution per se, nor to oppose economic progress. What he did, above all else, was support Prussian King William I. So we shouldn't see Bismarck as opposed to this or that kind of reform so much as strongly in favor of a unified Germany under the leadership of a king. In 1862, William I wanted army reform and modernization, as did some liberals, but William refused to budge on certain other provisions, especially a 3-year term for recruits. And and Bismarck promised not to budge either, and then went ahead with the king's version of reform, bypassing parliament altogether by simply collecting taxes and dispensing them as the king wanted. This, among many other actions, made Bismarck enemies of all kinds, partly because of his bullying manner, but he continued to be supported by the one person who really counted, the Prussian king. So for several decades, but most pressingly in the post-1848 atmosphere, a major question was who would lead the Germans, Austria or Prussia? Serving King William I loyally was Bismarck's key to promoting Prussia as the dominant power for Germans. Sometimes people interpret Bismarck as like an all-seeing visionary who carefully plotted every step he took on behalf of Prussia, but historians have now mostly come to believe that Bismarck's political moves were not part of some pre-planned game of 4D chess to outmaneuver Austria. Instead, he just had a gift for improvisation. For example, in 1864, he made an alliance with Austria to settle the status of two contested provinces, Schleswig and Holstein. So Bismarck persuaded Austria to join Prussia in war against Denmark to resolve the contested rule of Schleswig-Holstein. Their victory gave Prussia administration of Schleswig and Austria got Holstein. 2 years later, Prussia and Austria went to war again, this time with each other over the same two provinces. The Austro-Prussian War lasted just over 6 weeks thanks to Prussia's aforementioned commitment to the professionalism and modernization of its army. So this whole affair was masterfully handled by Bismarck. First, get your enemy Austria to help you defeat your other enemy Denmark, then defeat Austria, and boom, congratulations, you've got Schleswig-Holstein, which only sounds like a disease. But it likely wasn't planned that way, which gets at something important about history. Did the center of the world just open? Is there a magic 8-ball in there? All right, magic 8-ball, is the European Union going to hold up okay? It is certain. The thing about history is that it always feels certain because, it already happened. So when we in the present look at Bismarck in the past and the unification of Germany, it all feels like extraordinarily strategic. But I would argue that in the multiverse, there's a bunch of worlds where it doesn't work out the way that it worked out for us. History is what happens to have happened, and we are all making that together, just as Bismarck and everyone else in 19th century Europe was making it. But back to Bismarck. So following this big victory, King William wanted to keep going, to capture Vienna, maybe even Hungary. But Bismarck, with his usual astuteness in international affairs, encouraged the king to pull back and consolidate, as Prussia was now the leading German nation. Bismarck had drawn the northern German kingdoms and states into the North German Confederation, while also aiming to draw in the German states that were still resisting joining Prussia. And how he did this was kind of brilliant in a dark, artsy sort of way. Bismarck deeply understood the growing power of mass-market media, like newspapers, and he knew how to feed rumors to them. For instance, there was a battle over who would take the throne of tiny Luxembourg, someone allied with Prussia or someone allied with Napoleon III. As the contest heated up, Bismarck got a personal quote in the papers to the effect that the French were, quote, not the fine people they are usually considered to be, and were, in fact, loudmouthed people given over to bold, violent behavior. Meanwhile, he also doctored a telegram sent from the Prussian king to make it appear insulting to the French. And then in August 1870, the French National Assembly, outraged at these characterizations, declared war. The French were handily defeated, with Napoleon III and an army of 150,000 people captured on September 2nd. The Bavarians, along with smaller states, then had to join Prussia, and in January of 1871, the German Empire was declared in the Hall of Mirrors at the Versailles Palace, and all because of Luxembourg. Although much of the earlier opposition to Bismarck had died down at this point, he still had to forge a nation from these disparate states, one with its own institutions and its own culture. This was a fraught task, which he did in his signature style, more experimentally than sure-footedly. Bismarck's specific moves to unite the many German states into a consolidated entity are now called negative integration, that is, building a community or nation by finding enemies or targeting certain categories of individuals to be outcasts. Negative integration is opposed to positive integration based on acts like sharing values and building consensus among citizens. In the 1870s, Bismarck chose to harass, disadvantage, and insult Catholics with the idea of turning citizens against them and uniting Germany in opposition to Catholicism. The cluster of policies against Catholics was called Kulturkampf, and eventually Bismarck abandoned it, not because he didn't want it to work, but because there was widespread outrage among Germans, including Protestants, at the idea of upending religious toleration and making fellow citizens outcasts. Next, Bismarck targeted workers, especially Social Democrats, aka Socialists. Social Democrats were increasing their numbers in elections, and also there were 2 assassination attempts on William I's life, which Bismarck used as an excuse for outlawing the Social Democratic Party. Obviously, it's very important to understand how negative integration works and how the systematic dehumanization of an other to unite a country can become not just problematic, but indeed catastrophic. And I want to be clear that Bismarck didn't invent negative integration or anything, but he did use it. He also put into effect the first social welfare program in the West, which included accident and sickness protection for workers and also unemployment benefits, which were crucial because beginning in 1873, Europe and the world experienced an economic downturn that started in industry, not in agriculture, as had been the case in the past. In a letter to his wife, Bismarck had called Prussia's defeat of France a great event in world history. And so it was, as in Italy, and some would say the United States, victories of professional armies had created unified nations. And it's important to understand that nations were not inevitable or natural forms. Some were built on creating shared beliefs and constitutions. In others, negative integration was key to nation building, as countries identified themselves in opposition to others, or by clearly defining what they weren't. In Germany, the aristocratic land-owning office corps became demigods to the citizenry that believed in them and in military might, while industrialists and economic innovators fell behind political influence. And when you think about your own communities, whether that's a nation state or a fandom, I think it's interesting to consider whether you are defined primarily by what you share or by what you are, or defined primarily by what you are not or what you are opposed to. We'll see how the many ingredients of nation building is.
And we will stop there. So if you paid attention, and I know that got really complicated, but I gave you some really good hints as to what you need to be able to do for your SAQ. Obviously, we're not going to get to it in class. It is going to be homework. Please get it done before 11:59 tonight.
Hi, I'm John Green,
Then
and this is Crash Course.
tomorrow, we're getting into something brand new. Going to be talking about the Industrial Revolution. We got a minute or two left. Y'all go ahead and do what you're doing.